Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Learning to swim is a magical time in a child's life. The excitement of the water, playing with friends, making memories on vacations that will last a lifetime. British Swim School has locations throughout the U.S. where we specialize in teaching anyone to swim, from babies to adults, beginners to those who need a refresher. British Swim School's instructors make learning to swim fun with gentle teaching methods. Sign up your kids for swim lessons at britishswimschool.com.
Hello audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of Australia's and the world's most fascinating and important contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, our guest is Dr. Christine Fair. Christine is a professor in the Peace and Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. And we are speaking with her on the recent and dramatic fall of Kabul. Christine, welcome to The Focus.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Christine, was the fall of Kabul an inevitable, tragic final chapter of America's commitment to supporting a government unable or unwilling to fight for its own survival?
Okay, so I'm going to disagree with the premise of that question for many reasons. So let's first of all talk about the political process that produced elected Afghan officials. So going back to the Bonn and the earliest days of the post-Taliban era, the international community foisted upon Afghanistan a constitution that would enable the United States, and of course later NATO, to have a fairly pliant leader. A strong man is what they wanted. Hamid Karzai was the strong man of the moment. So political parties was not something that was given any focus. So try imagining having an efficacious parliament in Australia without parties. This was desired by Karzai. We were all aboard with it because we didn't want there to be a strong parliament to put checks on what Karzai was doing. So without having political parties, you have to form coalitions on very specific issues. And also not having parties means that candidates for any given office would never be whittled down. So let's take I think it's 33 some odd seats for the Walesi Jirga. In Kabul alone, there's 34 seats. In the 2018 election, there was something like 660 candidates. So the person that got the most votes had single digits. Okay. So this was not a process that was ever going to produce political stability by design. Second, let's actually talk about the ANA. The alleged training that the Americans did, right? So there's been so much talk about how much training we gave the ANA, both as a part of bilateral efforts, but also as a part of the ISAF and Resolute support. So I've done a lot of studies on that training. I've been on the ground. I've been at these training facilities. They were all rubbish. Why were they rubbish? Well, they were never actually provided by our armed forces. They were instead provided through contractors. Contractors took a lot of money, mostly to pay for their outrageous expenses and to pay, these Americans that would sort of, and they were generally Americans. There was some British firms as well that would come in, do their training and go home. Just as it was in Iraq, people came to the party late in understanding the fact that the Taliban were waging an all-out assault on the Afghan government and the US NATO presence. So they didn't even start training the police until after 2007. right? And
Right.
if I were to say that the training of the ANA was shambolic, the training of the police was a joke. And let's talk about the weapons that they were trained on. The Americans were adamant that they were to be using American weapon systems. Well, there's a reason why American weapon systems are not preferred by low capital militaries throughout the world. They're hard to use, they're hard to maintain, they are expensive, and they are finicky. When you use them right, they're very good. When you do not use them correctly, they are basically a paperweight. We were adamant that whether it was aircraft or whether it was a basic infantry rifle, we were adamant that they not use anything but US equipment. So let's talk about the Air Force, right? We tried to build an Air Force, and the problems of illiteracy and innumeracy, which hobbled our efforts to train the ANA, were even more so, right? Because anyone who knows anything about Air Force recruitment, you know that these are people who need to be substantively more educated and educable, right, than your average infantry grunt. So the same set of problems that were completely crippling in the ANA efforts were made having an effective Air Force impossible. So now let's talk about what the Americans did when they didn't have a large footprint. So most of us who send our loved ones off to war, my brothers are infantry, they had to fight in the ignominious Iraq War. I take for granted that they have on their person basic hazardous first aid tools. So if they get shot in the leg, they sprinkle some powder in their leg. It's not going to save their life. It's going to stabilize them. Well, the Afghans don't have this, right? They get shot in the leg, they get thrown in a Hilux, and they bleed out on the way to some sort of medical facility, which may or may not have been able to help them in the first instance. Afghanistan is not a place that's friendly to road travel. You have to have airborne civilian casualty capabilities. The Americans were providing that the casualty evacuation because the Afghans don't have that capability. Let's talk about suppressive air force. You need to have suppressive air power. You have to be able to put some bombs on asses when the Taliban have you pinned down. Well, the Americans were providing that too. Right. So essentially all of the civilian support services that your soldiers or my soldiers take for granted when they go into battle, the ANA did not have that. And one of the perduring problems is that getting the ANA paid, a lot of these guys were just not getting paid. Their commanders were just sucking off the money. And we knew this. We really failed to sort of build in payment mechanisms. All right, so if you are the ANA and you have none of these capacities and you just want to live, and I completely forgot to tell you that the Taliban were threatening them and their families, and who's there to protect them? What are you going to do?
So basically what you're saying, there was no saving the Afghan national government.
I would say that the United States and its partners made a series of very early decisions that may have aided the short-term expectations of what the international community would be doing, that undermined in perpetuity a viable Afghanistan without an enduring international presence. Now, by the way, I find it ludicrous when people say, well, we can't stay there forever. Well, as a matter of fact, look how long the Americans have been in South Korea. That's pretty close to forever, given the time frame of the average American memory, right? Look how long the Americans have been in Europe. Look how long we have been in various other places across the world. We've been there. Most Americans don't even know we're there. It's become so normalized. It's just part of the budgetary process.
Yeah, but in Afghanistan, they were being shot at, though. I mean, in South Korea,
we have not actually had casualties since we basically had a very small footprint. We weren't taking casualties. The Afghans were taking the casualties. What we were doing, we were providing all of those support services that enabled the Afghans to fight. And so when the Americans left, basically the ANA understood that they were on their own. So let me try to put into perspective. I wish I had a good Australian example I don't. But let's take Kashmir. I think a lot of people are familiar with Kashmir.
Sure.
So in Kashmir is about a third the size of Afghanistan, possibly smaller. I'm just looking at the part that's administered by India. India has about 300,000 Indian Army personnel there. That's about the equivalent size of all of the Afghan National Army. India doesn't have ghost soldiers. So if there's 300,000, there's 300,000. ANA, there's a lot of ghost soldiers, people for whom salaries were paid, but for whom no person exists. By the way, we knew about that. This was part of the corruption that we allowed to happen to get commanders to be acquiescent to what we were asking them to do, which was dangerous. If you want people to do something dangerous, you pay them more. And this was one of the off-books ways that we facilitated those payments. So this is not entirely on the Afghans. I'm tired of the Afghans being solely held responsible for the corruption that largely we built. So 300,000 in Kashmir is real, 300,000 in Afghanistan is not real. Afghanistan is a giant paperweight, just mountains all over the place. There's a reason why the ring road went around the mountains. It's very difficult to just take a hypotenuse from Herat to Kabul. This is not how Afghanistan's geography works. Historically, Afghan leaders eschewed having road and rail connectivity because they understood that was how they would be colonized, right? And you're sitting on the border of the Russian Empire and the British Empire. That's why there were no railroads. So Kashmir, in contrast, has very good ground lines of communication. They're very good ALOCs as well. So in addition to the 300,000 Indian military personnel, there are just a bedazzling array of police and paramilitary forces who are also, they are militarily competent in the sense that they have all of those capabilities that we discussed. They have air power to bring to bear, and they have hazardous. I'm not saying that they're, model human rights
I get that.
adherence, right?
Yeah.
But that's and India still has breakthroughs. So you take all of those things that the Indians have with considerably more resources, with a third of the territory, and then you put something far less than that in a larger, more inhospitable environment. And of course, India also has the advantage of generally having, with the exception of the border with Pakistan, secure borders. Afghanistan does not have secure borders. And then obviously thrown on top of that, everyone understands that the Taliban are actually an invading force of Pakistan. So I submit to you, these underpaid guys, they confronted insurmountable odds and they wanted to live.
I have to say, from hearing what you've just said, this seems to be a defeat we deserved, we in the West who participated.
It's not our defeat. You see, that's the other thing that's really pissing me off. This isn't about your government or my government. It's about the Afghans. Now, so I frame it differently. So Afghanistan is a very young country because of math. I mean, people have just been dying off through war and through illness and inadequate access to basic healthcare and nutrition. It's a very young country. So the majority of Afghans have grown up in the last 20 years expecting that they were going to have, it's not going to be a great life. It's not going to be like Australia or Canada. I'm not going to say the United States because right now we are a shithole. But they had an expectation that they could have dreams. We told them this. And while we were nurturing these dreams and we were telling girls and women that they could go to school, they could work, we were taking the rug out from underneath them. And now we've simply abandoned them. And I think the most criminal are those hundreds of thousands of Afghans that worked with your army, my army, NATO. I get emails every day from people saying, I worked with the US, I worked with NATO, I worked with one of my friends in the Australian Army. He's trying to get his interpreter out. We have all abandoned them. And given the situations, there are not even embassies on the ground. Many of the defense contractors, because typically the defense contractors were the payer, not our national armies, they've long left the country. How do they get employment letters?
I'm curious about that because here in Australia, we always follow America's lead on pretty much everything. And what you guys have done so successfully is this whole
Oh,
public-private way of doing things, contracting,
successfully?
outsource. Oh,
That's
well, I use that, with my parentheses well and truly in the frame here. But I've got to say, it's like, you see this, you hear what I'm just listening to what you're having to say. This is truly a cataclysmic moment for those people who truly believe that you can fight a war with contractors in this sort of public-private, hand-on-hand sort of situation, because the systemic problems that flow from it are disastrous for the local people that you're ostensibly trying to help, right? Or at least
oh
that's
yeah.
what the
Look,
politicians would have to say.
there are so many problems with this. I mean, so obviously I've been on the ground a lot, right? I've
Yeah.
interacted with these contractors. In fairness, I've at times when we were allowed to have, what do they call it? PSD, personal security, basically dudes with guns and muscles. Uh, they were all contractors. They were there and provided me safety. So I don't want to sound ungrateful, but let's talk about some of the basics, right? So they are not subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They are not subjected to the local laws. So they operate in a gray zone of what I believe the technical term is doing whatever the fuck they want. And they get away with it because there is no system that holds them accountable. So this produced, for example, some of the most egregious atrocities in Iraq, where they were essentially Blackwater was using hollow tip bullets, which caused just catastrophic injuries. The exit wounds just ground the victim up, wounds that they would not have ordinarily died from if they were using lawful ammunition, but they weren't. So the incentives for bad behavior is rife. But then I think as a citizen, the genius, if you will, of contractors is that they're off the books. There's no legal requirement to report how many contractors die. And these, I know from my brother's own experience, when they were sent off to Iraq, they had civilian jobs. They were in the National Guard. So they built their life and their debt structure, like their house, their family, on their civilian pay. And my brothers are enlisted. They're not officers. So my brother was a highly skilled tool and die worker. He was making in Indiana, he was making actually twice as much as I was as a RAND analyst living in California. So
Okay, that's saying something.
You can do the right. You can do the math on that.
Yep.
But you can also do the math on what happened when he was deployed, as I believe he was an E9. So he had problems paying his bills. I mean, at times, fortunately, they had a sister who had nothing but dogs and manicure bills. So I could help. But I don't know how many other people were in that situation. So when they were literally demobilizing and they were getting ready to leave the country, Blackwater recruiters, Triple Canopy, this whole, evil Benetton commercial of defense contractors, they basically said, hey, son, you've served your country for a year. How much money did you lose? Do you want to come and make some of that money back? And he was really tempted. And both his wife and I, my older brother in particular, because he had children at this point, his son was born while he was deployed. Yeah. So, if you get killed in a U.S. Army uniform, that's one thing. If you get killed in a Blackwater uniform, how do you explain that to your children? I mean, that's just, no, dude, get your ass home. But there are a lot of other people who did not have, who had different logics, right? And so this was one of the ways in which you were taking a public asset, right, which is a trained national soldier, and they're doing very similar jobs, but at a very significantly higher pay, right? So we're paying more for a comparable infantry person. But if that person is killed or injured, they're not reported. So I have tried for many years to see what are the contractor casualties compared to our armed forces casualties. It's impossible to find. The only way you can find them, we have this thing called OSHA. So if they are in a primary contract and they're killed, OSHA is required. You're required to report that to OSHA. But if you're on a secondary contract, you disappear, right? And then the other moral hazard is that we had a bunch of third country nationals, and we were exploiting the fact that they came from poor countries and they would do the same job as an American or a British or an Australian mercenary, which is, I believe, the correct terminology. We calling them defense contractors make it sound as if they're all installing, air conditioners in shoes.
Yeah.
Right. But they're taking the same bullet, a fraction of the money. It kind of reminds me of the British Army when the Indians were deployed to Flanders, right? And they learned they were being paid 1/10 of what a white soldier was being paid. And the bullets were not like, oh, tally ho, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't mean to shoot you because you are a poor underpaid grunt. I meant to shoot the white fellow. No, the bullets don't do that. So, just so many moral hazards, just bringing in the most vulnerable people and taking advantage of their precarity. And the end result is we all paid more for less, and there's no visibility. And then the other issue is, again, I'm not a complete asshole. I'm only partially an asshole. When these contractors come home, they have the same problems as soldiers. Yeah. They have PTSD. They have difficulty integrating because they have been out in the kill zone. And then because Americans, I don't know about Australia, but obviously we fetishize our armed forces, except when it comes time to taking care of them.
Oh yeah,
and
we have that here,
right? I think this is the curse of the volunteer army, right? Because people can then say, "Oh, you volunteered for it; it was your job."
That's right. And this is one of the things that, having looked at the all-volunteer force structure back in my academic career, I've always been more of a fan of the idea of a broader base of soldiery coming from the citizens, because that probably is a greater leveler and it allows people to see up close and personal the horror of things. With the all-volunteer force structure, it seems to me that those who are actually in national uniforms tend to be the Praetorian Guard of the government in power. And now with the use of contractors, the dirty work gets done by them, so that at least the ones that are in the national uniform don't appear to be the ones carrying that sort of morally not so virtuous kind of thing forward.
Absolutely. They are a scourge.
Yeah.
But then this contractor stuff also belies another fiction that we've been told. Americans, we hear, oh, you've spent $2.6 trillion in Afghanistan and nothing has happened that's enduring and so forth. And I roll my eyes and say, well, that's a great story if it were anything but really rank bullshit. Why do I say it's rank bullshit? Because everything we did was through contractors. So when you look at the defense expenditures on American personnel, that's money that comes right back to our economy, right? That's not money that we're writing this magnanimous check to the Afghans, right? Yeah. All that money came back to the U.S. economy, right? Supporting their families, paying their rent, car payments. Those were all U.S. economic activities that were stimulated by these payments. When we did contractors, obviously we paid them a lot more. So, I've been working on this problem set for a really long time, but I remember Ambassador Holbrooke, who I knew reasonably well. We were on a congressional panel, and he had been hired to sort of figure out, like, how much money are we wasting through USAID? And his team that he had gathered to look at this, he estimated that for every $1 we allocated to Afghanistan, 90 cents came back in contractor fees or other fees. Like that 90 cents in one way or another came back to the US economy. And what makes it so difficult to figure out is that USAID and everyone else, they really refuse to tell us how much money stayed in Afghanistan. They refuse because they don't want the truth to be known that US aid really is US aid. This also obfuscates what is the real cost of staying in Afghanistan. Because if we're paying American firms outrageous fees when there are less expensive ways to do that, that's on us. But if you saw Eric Prince, the Dark Lord of Blackwater, his sister was our Secretary of Education, right?
Betsy DeVos.
Betsy DeVos, as I
Yep.
preferred, Betty DeVille. But I mean, he had Trump's ear. He's like, man, let me take over the war for you. These, and at some point there become these institutional lobbying efforts. Let's continue doing this. And all the arguments that we think are evil, they think are good, right? We get to do your dirty work. We are not reportable. No one knows how many of us die because we're taking these inordinate risks. We need to have a lot more money. And it's just an extraordinary way to wage a war at higher cost with worse outcomes and no accountability.
Here is something that I want to pick you up on. Look, there's been a lot of media commentary following the fall of Kabul. Everyone's blaming Biden for the mess, and everyone's blaming other places for their respective roles and stuff, and that's fine. But really, in the end, I want to find out. Earlier, you sort of took a bit of offense to the fact that we can characterize this as a defeat for the United States. So, from a strategic level perspective, isn't this all part of this new thing called the gray zone? But this is the American version of gray zone. We tend to think in the West that the gray zone threat comes from Russia, or it comes from Iran, or it comes from China. And obviously they are also observing what the United States is doing and how their methods of operations move on, especially with regard to contractors. And the Chinese, even though they're way, way behind in the pack here, they are starting to pick up where the Russians are also very active in this role by using their own contractors. The Russians have got the Wagner Group. I don't think that these guys are morally any less nasty than the folk at Blackwater. So really, are we now seeing gray zone combat being played out as the future of warfare, based not just on what we see from the West looking out to the more, dare I say, Orientalist powers acting against our interests, but our own militaries sort of entering this field now through the contractors and so on and so forth in order to give the enemy the bloody nose, so we have these unaccountable guys going out doing the nasty in the middle of Baghdad or in the middle of Kabul.
So, I mean, I see it as an extension of proxy war, whereas we used to have these militias that we would support to go against the militias supported by our adversary during the Cold War. This is an extension of that. I mean, I suspect, a lot of the forces that have been, well, suspect isn't the right word because I kind of know, the folks that are in Iraq. I mean, it's for many years, there were more contractor personnel in Afghanistan. I'm almost certain that's true in Iraq than there were active military personnel. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. So the other thing that they do is that I imagine back in the day when you were a diplomat and you had to go out to some dodgy place, typically the military would provide your transport. Well, in these places, the military, I mean, obviously it got to be so bad that when British, and I don't know if Australia did this, but I know the British and the Americans did, they wouldn't even let Americans travel by road from the airport to their respective fortresses called their embassies. They would instead be flown on chopper. Right. Those aren't military choppers. When I was in Iraq in 2008, I did a study of PRTs, and I went to all these PRTs. There's 3 of us on the team. Blackwater provided all of our air coordinates. Sometimes our ground movements, usually our ground movements, we would go out with the unit that was responsible for the task that we were investigating, and they were military. But like if you were doing car transport, it was all Blackwater. And that's why the U.S. Embassy the U.S. government was so protective of Blackwater, as they said they never lost a principle. I said, yeah, but they killed all these Iraqis to protect your asses unnecessarily. So you talk about like the white person's burden or whatever snide comment we want to characterize that with. But I was just stunned. It's like could not have they protected you without killing a bunch of innocent Iraqis unnecessarily? Does it have to be they protected us and killed a whole bunch of people, or we're going to be slaughtered?
Well, isn't the old American saying peace through superior firepower? I mean, that's really that in action, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't familiar with that phrase, but sure. I was familiar with go big or go home. And I'm like,
Well,
yeah, I really didn't want to be here anyway. So, hey, I'm heading home.
oh, gosh. Anyway, I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's A Focus podcast, and we're speaking with Dr. Christine Fear on the fall of Kabul and its aftermath. Christine, the Taliban have now inherited a treasure trove of American military hardware following Washington's decision to leave Afghanistan. What do you think will... Yeah, what do you think is going to be the fate of these weapons? Are they going to be integrated into Taliban ranks, or are they going to be sold off on the black market, or maybe off to the Pakistanis, Chinese, and Russians?
So I don't know. It's a really interesting question, because ordinarily the Taliban, I mean, certainly Taliban 1.0 would struggle to use these weapon systems and certainly maintain them and get them resupplied and maintained. They're still going to have those problems, but they have the Pakistanis. Yeah. And the Pakistanis, if you look at all of the Pakistanis celebrating this victory, including armed forces personnel posing with the Taliban on the border, you see that this is not anything but a Pakistan invasion via the Taliban. So I suspect there's going to be some Pareto optimum outcome that involves all of the things that you discussed. They'll integrate what they can integrate. They'll sell what they can sell on the black market. And the things that they want to keep, they will rely very heavily upon the Pakistanis for training and resupply. I hope the Blackwaters crash and take all the little Talibanjos with them. That's my fantasy. Sorry, maintenance is a bitch. And helicopters, who thought that's a stable thing to take into the air? I'm always amazed that helicopters don't crash every day. And in the kind of environment of Afghanistan, where they're both necessary, but they're very difficult to operate given the nature of the terrain. I mean, there might be, it's not going to be a cakewalk for them to use them. But the Pakistanis would certainly love to have them. So I don't know. I'm not very good at, I'm not a crystal ball lady.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to push you into that corner a little bit, but later. For now, I'll give you an easy one. So, if we talk about that sort of black and white thing that's going on in the media right now, the Americans lost the war. Could you then say that the Pakistanis were the net beneficiaries of the Taliban's victory?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So there was a victor. There may not have been a loser per se, but there's certainly
there are a lot of losers. So look, I mean, there's a lot of losers. The Afghans are the biggest losers. The Afghans have lost their future. So look, I'm not going to say the Americans didn't lose, but what does lose mean? Islamist militants throughout the world, they had this narrative about the Soviet Union that, a bunch of ragtag men with just the love of Allah in their heart defeated the Soviet Union. That's not really true, right? It's like you had the Americans providing you weapons via the Pakistanis, who actually had been doing it long before us. Like the Pakistanis began this on their own in 1974. We did not start the jihad. That's just one of the biggest fictions out there. It drives me nuts. But we did, Pakistan had this jihad policy. It went to 7, and to rip off Spinal Tap, we took it to 11. And so it was our force multiplying efforts that enabled the Mujahideen to defeat the Soviets. It was just war by attrition. What I actually find really kind of astonishing is that we didn't really and we were doing that from Pakistan, right? What always amazed me, and I try to explain this, break it down to people like they were in the 4th grade so that possibly they might understand, given American complete paucity of historical memory, that so you do realize that we actually are the Soviet Union in this case, and the Taliban are the Mujahideen, and Pakistan is playing its role. So if the Soviets did not feel comfortable going into Pakistan because it was a US ally, how did you think we were going to defeat the Taliban if we did not go into Pakistan? But here the fuckery is Pakistan was supposed to be our ally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. But the Chinese basically own Pakistan right now, which adds another level of complication.
But when the war began, that wasn't true. I mean,
no, that's true. That is true.
So, I mean, the analogy that I use, and it might be offensive, but I also believe it to be accurate. You know, going to war with Pakistan was like setting up a daycare and putting like a pedophile priest in charge of it, and then wondering, oh, what possibly could go wrong? Except not wondering what possibly could go wrong, right? So this is, you know, if you look at a map, and so I have the view that the war as we fought it never should have been fought at all, because you shouldn't go into a war if there's not some likelihood of winning by some measure of winning, and that's the other issue. Is anyone who study insurgencies know what for the counterinsurgent, and I don't like calling the Taliban insurgents because they're fully owned subsidiaries of the Krapistani state. But in a traditional understanding of insurgency, the counterinsurgents have to show hegemony of force. They have to control the battle space. For the insurgents, or in this case, the proxy elements of Pakistan, to win, they simply have to prevent the counterinsurgents from doing that. So if you're playing whack-a-mole, the mole always wins because the mole pops up. So if you were to look at insurgency, the whole notion of population-centric counterinsurgency, from my point of view, is garbage. I can't find an example of where it really worked. Malaya is frequently touted.
Yeah, it is.
But Malaya used concentration camps, just move people out of one place.
I'm so glad you said that, because I thought the same damn thing, you know. And if you look at the historical photographs of these so-called safe areas, they looked pretty ominous, I have to say. They didn't look like welcoming centers, yeah?
No, seriously. They were camps where people were concentrated.
Yeah, true.
And they weren't there voluntarily, most importantly. I'd like to go out for a stroll outside of my camp of concentration. Right? They weren't there because they were like, oh, I feel totally safe here. I'm just going to stay here and get a manicure and a pedicure and also get my brows waxed. That's not what went down. So the insurgencies that I study have actually involved just essentially depopulating the individuals willing to fight, but most importantly, putting such a burden on their families that they don't want their children to fight. So especially in South Asia, where the expectation is that a surviving son will take care of the parents, you take away all the surviving sons, the parents are indigent. Sri Lanka, that's what they did the Tamils, just depopulated. Of course, in Sri Lanka, they also had female fighters. So apart from killing them, before killing them, they raped them, killed them, and then they sometimes raped their corpses, right? So this idea of population-centered counterinsurgency is such rubbish. So the Americans and our allies, which are generally speaking Western democracies, we would have had to have done that to the Pashtuns. Like we couldn't have. I mean, as shitty as we were in Cambodia and Vietnam, and we were really shitty, like basically war criminals, that war criminality would have had to have been much more intensively conducted in Afghanistan. We would have essentially had to depopulate the Pashtun base from which they're recruiting.
Which is the majority of the population. You can't do that.
Yeah. Well, we don't know this is the majority. I mean, because there hasn't been a census in like forever. So I don't want to normalize the idea that the Pashtuns are the majority, because we don't know. That's part of like a Pakistani talking point, because they think the Pashtuns is their source of strategic depth. But we actually don't know. And so I don't want to get into like, but what we can say is it's pretty fucking sizable.
But let's revisit this whole thing with Trump, because I mean, the whole notion of, you know, engaging with the Taliban really picked up steam under the Trump administration. And then, of course, Trump made all these wacky notions public about we want to withdraw our forces, it's going to be good for America, we don't want to have Americans fighting other people's wars, so on and so forth. But then to add insult to injury, of course, we get President Joe Biden in, who effectively carried on the Trump bandwagon effectively, right? So
Okay, so I want to be, I want to be really clear about this, because this is I'm a liberal. I voted for Biden. I was not happy about voting for Biden. I'm of that age. I remember what he did to Anita Hill. It's one thing that a Republican did this to a woman. It's another that he did it, and he never made right by it. So saying I'm sorry is not made right. How about I am going to begin proceedings to impeach Justice Thomas, who never should have been on the Supreme Court. And oh, by the way, I'm also going to impeach Kavanaugh, because we don't know who paid off his outrageous debts. And he was pushed through by a president who had been impeached. That's how you make this shit right. I'm sorry. I have problems with him. But what people do not want to remember, or they may not remember because they may have never known, is that he's doing what he always wanted to do. So again, I know this because I was selected to be DAS. I was read in, I was interacting. I had dinner at his house. There's like 6 of us. We were literally at a dinner table. We were talking about this stuff. So this is not something that was foisted upon him, right? That is just complete garbage. This is what he wanted to do when he was VP. He had this notion called counterterrorism plus. He was not wrong that counterinsurgency could not be fought and won in Afghanistan. I don't think he ever fully understood all of the reasons why that was. The things that we had just discussed. You have to depopulate much of Pashtuns. It's not kosher or halal under international law. And I don't think he ever fully grasped the Pakistan problem. He came in. Here's the other thing that you have to remember. He was VP for 8 years. George W. Bush looked into Musharraf's eyes and saw his soul, just like he did Putin. I don't know where they saw souls, where souls did not exist, but I don't know Bush's optometrist. But Bush refused to understand that Musharraf had already done a U-turn on the U-turn. Right? The under Musharraf, Pakistan was fully giving support, and his intelligence. His various intelligence agencies, they certainly knew this. I interacted with them. I knew it, and I wasn't even an intelligence asset. I just did this thing called read the Pakistani papers, which I suppose intelligence people never have to do because they like reading shit that came through a classified channel, which was usually things in the Pakistani papers that some major read and put his or her name on it and thus was classified. But we all knew this. And we were continuing to pretend that Pakistan was our ally. They didn't want to get rid of the Musharraf show. So he was just simply wrapped up in the Iraq war that he couldn't really get his shit together. Like my colleagues, on his NSC would say, we have an hour to spend on these issues, 55 minutes to be spent on Iraq, and the remaining would be on Afghanistan and if Pakistan, if it came up. So, but when Obama came in, he was the beneficiary of, believe it or not, an unlikely hero, the U.S. government accounting office, which said, hey, Bush, you've been fighting this war for nearly 8 years. You've not had a net assessment. That's kind of weird. We need to see a net assessment. And then in that summer, as he was coming up Bush was not coming up for re-election, but obviously the Republicans wanted to win, and he wanted to create, a place where Republicans would be in a favorable position, vice Obama. They did all of these assessments, and Obama came in. He hired Bruce Riedel to be the assessor of the assessments that would eventually give rise to the Obama policy. So in those interagency debates, Biden was always saying, this coin stuff is rubbish. We should be doing counterterrorism plus. So he's doing what he wanted to do. And that's really, really important. So, in essence, Trump, he thought he was just going to create a shit sandwich and hand it over to Joe Biden without even the courtesy of a napkin. But he actually did what Biden always wanted to do, which is get out of this war. The agreement that the Americans signed with the Taliban, which was nothing but an effort to normalize them. He could have said, look, Taliban Joes, you have failed consistently to honor any of your commitments. You said you're going to stop shooting. You haven't stopped shooting. You said you're going to stop blowing up shit. You haven't stopped blowing up shit. Yeah. We don't feel obliged to honor this agreement that you have honored repeatedly in its breach. And so new sheriff is in town. I'm Sheriff Joe Biden. We're tearing this up and wiping our asses with it. He could have done that. And, Americans right now, they're so busy waging war on Dr. Fauci and the mask. No one would have cared.
Professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, Christine Fair. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, Christine Fair, and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Until next time, this is John Bruni, signing off.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.